Welcome to Restaurant Deal Making Exposed, the only show that equips you with everything you need to know about restaurant transactions. In this show, we tell you all about how to make the sale or purchase of your restaurant not just possible, but successful. Now here are your hosts, ex-restaurateurs and seasoned brokers, Patrick Toda and Andy Mirabel.
Hello, everyone. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the emotional roller coaster that sellers often experience during a transaction. Selling a business, especially one you've built or nurtured over time, can be an intense and personal journey. Even the most level-headed individuals can find themselves rattled by the complexities and pressures of the process. We'll be discussing the highs, lows, and everything in between, offering insights on how to navigate the emotional landscape from a seller's perspective. Today, I have Dave Peter, the man behind the Galley's legacy in Morro Bay. Dave Peter is best known as a former owner of the Galley Seafood Grill and Bar, landmark restaurant in Morro Bay. Originally founded in 1966, the Galley became an iconic dining destination under his leadership. Dave, the second owner of the restaurant, grew up in Morro Bay and first worked at the Galley as a busboy in his teens. After building a successful career in the tech industry and living abroad in Germany, where he met his wife, Dave returned to his roots in Morro Bay. Upon his return, he partnered with the original owners, the Anderson family, to revitalize and eventually take over the Galley. Through his vision and dedication, Dave transformed the restaurant into a modern yet timeless establishment, all while preserving its rich history and charm. Today, the Galley remains a beloved institution, renowned for its fresh seafood and stunning views, continuing to thrive as one of the Central Coast's most popular dining destinations. I want to give a little bit of background on why we brought Dave out here today. After going into contract for the sale of the Galley, which I thought at the time felt like it was going very smoothly from my perspective, both the buyer and seller were acting reasonable. And my previous experience with Dave was that he was a level-headed individual who didn't appear overly emotional about the sale. However, as we navigated the typical ups and downs of the transaction, I noticed Dave became increasingly rattled, particularly in response to the buyer's actions. At one time, he even considered pulling out of the deal to look for a better buyer. This shift in Dave's demeanor highlighted an important topic I believe we should address, and that's the emotional roller coaster of a transaction. Even someone as composed as Dave was affected by the stress of the transaction, and I've seen this happen time and time again, including in my own experience selling my restaurant. It's important to normalize these feelings because the emotional toll is something that most sellers face, whether they anticipate it or not.
I can jump in here really too. I know, Patrick, you said that you've had that same feeling and experience in selling your own restaurant. I too have been in the shoes of selling my restaurants. And I had one in particular transaction that was absolutely challenging. It was emotional. It was long. There was so many unexpected curves and, changes to this transaction. And it was very difficult. I don't need to get into the details of it because that's why we have Dave here. And Dave, thank you so much for spending some time with us on the podcast today and really kind of stripping down and letting us know some of the things that another seller may not know about a transaction. And that really is, highlighted in some of the twists and turns and emotions that are involved in these transactions. So thank you. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
I guess getting to the decision to sell is the hardest part sometimes. And so when you really are committed to saying, yep, it's time, I'm ready to sell. How did that come about for you? How did you know it was the right time to sell? And when did you decide, let's go?
Well, as Patrick mentioned, I'd had a tech career and retired from that, and restaurant business had been a passion. Entered and opened the restaurant in 2007. At that time, mentally I'd said, I think I can do this for 15 years, which is almost exactly what it turned out to be. We sold in 2022, and which was exactly 15 years. So I turned 60 and I thought I was just ready to move on to a different phase of my life. As you well know, and I think your listeners would probably know, the restaurant business is a tough business. That's not a secret. And, building the restaurant, making it successful, and then in particular, the last 4 years through the pandemic represented a lot of challenges. We found our way through it successfully and emerged well out of the pandemic. But for me, it was just time. I wanted to move on and get focus on other projects at this stage in my life. That being said, it was a very emotional decision to finally say, we're going to put this business on the market.
Yeah, we've had clients that waver, that get right to the edge of saying yes and then go, you know what, I'm not. Even clients that have listed and then say, my heart's not in this. And I've had clients pause and say, I want to make listing inactive and I'm just not ready right now.
Well, I think in particular, too, a lot of people are selling restaurants because they're not what they expected, or they're not successful, they're not making enough money. Our situation was different. It was a successful restaurant. We were busy, we were full every night, and we were making money. I can understand that letting go of that.
Was it harder, Dave, given the fact that the Galley has so much so much history, so much legacy, did it make it that much harder?
Absolutely, 100%. I recall talking to Patrick about this in particular at the beginning. We didn't have to sell, we didn't need to sell. So we were really focused on finding the right buyer. That was kind of the number one criteria. We were the second owner. I was a part of the original business as a young man, working for the founders of the restaurant as a busboy and then sort of a assistant manager as I went through college. I had another career and came back to it. But continuing that legacy that the restaurant represented in the community was super important. And in fact, that was one of the main reasons I reached out to Restaurant Realty versus just listing with a local business broker. Number one, I was looking for the expertise, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, that both of you have a restaurant background. Understanding that was super important to me. But beyond that, we wanted to broaden the potential pool of buyers that we could reach. And I just didn't think I could reach that with just a local business broker or real estate broker selling the restaurant. So that's how we reached out to Restaurant Realty. In the end, ironically, we sold to a local buyer, a very qualified local buyer.
Yeah.
But I imagined in my mind that, number one, we weren't on the low end of the buying spectrum. We were, up a tier. And I imagined a restaurant group or a sophisticated buyer from another community, maybe San Francisco or LA, coming to the area to operate the restaurant. So that was the basis for our decision.
In the end, though, given Morro Bay is such a small, tight-knit community too, didn't it benefit you that it turned out to be someone local who understood the area? If you come from LA, it's apples and oranges. We're talking about vibe and operations and things like that.
100%. And in the end, we absolutely made the right decision. We found a very qualified local buyer that knew the community. One of the silent partners in the business happened to be good friends of the original founders many years back. So it was sort of serendipitous the way it turned out. And despite the issues we may have faced during the negotiation and the whole process, it turned out to be 100% the right decision in the end.
Well, let's get to some dirt, though, Patrick. We got to get to some of the dirty side of the transaction here, right?
So, Dave, looking back, is there anything you wish you had done differently emotionally during the transaction? Maybe like meditating or something to help you get through it?
I'm not really a meditator. I think the challenges were in part self-inflicted. We'd have to sell the restaurant. We weren't in a distress situation where we just needed to get out, so we had the opportunity to be a little bit selective about the buyer, which I think in turn meant we didn't have to just accept all of the terms that the buyer may have wanted. And I think it was, if I recall correctly, Patrick, it was some of those issues where at some point I said, hey, I just don't want to compromise on this or cave on this issue. And maybe it was a little bluff here and there, but I was like, we're ready to walk. You get emotionally attached, but at some point you just say, look, we were so focused on A, finding the right buyer, B, making sure that buyer would continue the legacy of the restaurant and what it meant to the community, and C, take care of the staff, that those three things were the most important. We placed all of those above any personal benefits, I think, that we would get out of the transaction. So there were points where we were like, hey, pause, we don't have to do this. We don't really want to. But thanks to Patrick, we got through that.
Well, we know Patrick's good at what he does. Now, hey, question then. You kind of brought something up that I think certain sellers and buyers don't quite understand, and maybe the listeners should hear too, is that on your top 3 list was that the buyer comes in and takes care of your staff, okay? We know as agents that staff is not part of the transaction. They are not property. They can't, they're not transferring with it, but you want to know that, especially with a legacy business like yours, that someone is going to value the team coming in, because that's part of what brings people back. I mean, it's wholeheartedly what most people come back for, is the same smiling faces and good teams. So I know that staff can really be part of some of the most emotional part of the transaction. So how did you help, Patrick? How did you guys work together to help nurture that and make sure that was let a buyer know that was a key goal?
Well, I think what's important to note here is that Dave was in there all the time. He was not the kind of person that was running it as an absentee owner. And the buyer potentially was going to be less hands-on. And I think that may have caused some concern. Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but that did have something to do with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, if you recall, we had a prior offer to the one where we actually sold, to the group we actually sold the restaurant to. And we ended that almost immediately because I just had a sense that buyer would not maintain the legacy or take care of the staff in the way we did. I mean, many of these people had not only worked with me for the 15 years, a large group, we had 35 or 40 employees, but 12 or 15 of them had been with me that entire time. And a few of them had been with the prior owners for many years. In fact, head guy in the kitchen at the time, he's still working there, had been with me and the Anderson family for 50 years as of last month.
Wow.
50 years as of last month.
That's not only, I always point that out to my clients and potential sellers, is I want to congratulate you on that because it's a testament to how you run things too. And obviously some were there before you got there, but for them to last 15 years with you, I mean, you must be very good at what you do and really put them on a pedestal, which keeps people there.
Yeah, well, we invested a lot in that. It's important, right? The point Patrick made is there's two things that keep customers coming back to the restaurant, and that is consistency in terms of the product and the experience, the food and the experience, and the staff, the friendly faces that they've gotten to know personally, really, over the years.
We keep bringing up an emotional attachment. I want to preface this a little bit differently. What were some emotional, highs and lows of the transaction during the negotiation process? And I know sometimes we negotiate to get an offer on the table and get terms agreed on, but even during the transaction, things come up. What were some of the points that either surprised you or, could be frustrating during the transaction, Dave?
Well, I think personally, I assume any other seller, you go through this emotional roller coaster, if you will, of is this deal going to close or not? There are days when you're like, you get your hopes up because you'd like to be done and you just want to make sure that you see this thing through to the end, and there are these little roadblocks and hurdles you have to get over in the way. So I think that's one issue. And then there are the sticking points in the deal where everybody has to make compromises in a transaction like this. I think it's very rare where you're always going to get whatever you want. And I think in particular, our issue was because of the value of the deal, there are terms about the allocation of where the funds are applied, whether it's assets or, whatever the issue may be, because those have tax implications for the buyer and the seller. And you have competing interests. What I wanted, he didn't want, and what he wanted, I didn't want from a tax perspective. That in particular was where Patrick was super helpful in getting us past those two types of hurdles.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So during a transaction, once you're in escrow, you have to work out what's called the purchase price allocation. And the seller and buyer have completely different strategies going on here. They're at odds, but they have to agree to something. And when you're talking about a transaction the size of this transaction, there's a lot of money on the table. And how Dave sees that money is either going to be income gain or income loss, or capital gain or capital loss, depending on his own tax situation. And for the buyer, it's completely different. They're setting their depreciation on something. So if you have something like, and I'm not giving any tax advice here, just for our listeners, something like goodwill, which this restaurant had a lot of, it's a 15-year depreciation schedule. If you allocate $100,000 on goodwill, you're putting a 15-year depreciation schedule. So it's a very long depreciation for the buyer, which may not be great for them. Whereas for Dave, putting it under goodwill would be, I believe, short-term or long-term capital gain. So you can see how you're at odds. And this did create a little bit of tension during the transaction.
That is a topic that's come up with, disagreements between buyer and seller, which is purchase price allocation. How about when it comes to, the difficulty of dealing with getting the lease assigned and stuff? One buyer coming in may have expectations of the lease, and, the seller may have had to jump through different hoops at the time. So was that a point that went smoothly, or?
Well, I think we're pretty fortunate in that regard. I had a good lease in place, which was attractive to the buyer, number one. And number two, I had landlords who were willing to work with us. So fortunately, that wasn't really a sticking point in this deal. I don't know, Patrick, do you want to say more about that, or?
I think I remember just one little, I think the landlord wanted a personal guarantee and the buyer wanted to deal with it a little bit differently. I think, it was like the expectation is like, is this normal? And just talking through that with you and just making you understand that, like, hey, this is a seasoned buyer and they're just trying to set themselves up for their own success, and just working that through, that this is a very normal thing that the buyer is doing versus your expectations of just like accepting it the way it was.
But I think you found a creative solution. I don't remember all the details, but I think you found a pretty creative solution for that too, and helped the buyer over the hurdle in this case.
I did, I believe. Yeah.
You're sounding like a true wizard on this episode, Patrick, with your allocation advice and your leasing help. Yeah, I really.
Patrick was great. He was great.
Hey, a certain person told me a long time ago, his name is Steve Zimmerman, that a deal dies 10 times before it goes through. And I cannot tell you how many times that has come into my head during a transaction. It's like, it's so true that, there's just so many things that, for a seller or a buyer, they think it's about to die. And, early on, and when I was a business broker, I thought it was going to die. But then I started to realize that these are very normal things. So, yeah.
That's a great point you bring up too. Certain things seem like they're insurmountable when you're in the transaction process between buyer and seller. If they're not, agreeing on something, they tend to work themselves out with, a little bit of guidance from our job and what we do, but also with level-headed, rational buyers and sellers, such as Dave.
Yeah. Just like Dave said earlier, as long as both sides are willing to make concessions, typically that's very helpful in getting a deal done. It's when one side wants to dig their heels in and, it has to feel good on both sides in the end.
You've got to be willing to compromise.
Yes.
I may be jumping over one of your topics, Patrick, here, but I think it's good. Buyers and sellers can often think that, I'm going to list, for example, from the seller perspective, I'm going to reach out to a qualified broker or agent and list my business. They're going to build a listing. They're going to promote it. Then they're going to find a quality buyer, bring it to the table. We're going to enter escrow, transfer the ABC, and move towards the finish line. But there's so many different nuances in between just those steps that actually can go one way or the other, for better or for worse. Dave, how would you prepare a seller, or what advice would you give to a seller who's preparing to sell their, business or restaurant or bar moving forward, and maybe some of the unexpected things that you could prepare them for?
Well, it sort of goes back to what I said right at the beginning of this podcast, is that I did a lot of research before I made a decision who we would list the business with. And, I've been in the community here a long time. I know a lot of people in the real estate business, both commercial business brokers, commercial real estate, residential real estate. But again, I knew, especially at the valuation where we wanted to sell the business, that having somebody who understood the business, had been an operator in the business in particular, understood the nuances of that, and could help communicate those benefits to a potential buyer were super, super important. Even though, we knew we would pay a higher transaction fee than you might with a local commercial broker, it was super important to us. And again, the reach issue. I think casting the net wide, again, as I said, we thought our buyer would come from out of the area potentially. And ultimately, we had 3 offers, all from local buyers, and we picked the best one. But I would advise anybody to think about going to a group like yours who seems to have very deep knowledge in this space. That expertise is super valuable.
Well, I think we greatly thank you for that and saying that here on the show organically. We are a niche type of agent, so we appreciate that vote of confidence.
Dave, can you tell me how you felt after the transaction was over, and maybe talk a little bit about your relationship with the buyer now?
Yeah. Well, I was relieved. In a way, it was hard because, I had a routine. I was very involved in the restaurant. I would go down every morning, be down there at 8:00, 3 hours before we opened, cleaning. That was one of my things, and organizing and planning. And it was very difficult for me to break that routine. There was a transition period after the deal closed where I worked, as I always had, for a couple of months, side by side with the buyer.
That was part of the terms, the training terms and such, to stay on to help support them?
Yeah, I think the terms were only a couple of weeks in the deal, and I stayed very involved for a couple of months. And in fact, I'm still involved in one aspect of the business. But it was an opportunity for me to really get to know the buyer during this period. For me, set aside any of those concerns or issues I may have had or feelings I may have had during the difficult parts of the transaction. So sure, happy the deal's done, the money's exchanged, there's a new operator. But the stress of running a restaurant, which is a very real thing, didn't go away right away. I still felt like I had to be involved to successfully complete this transaction. And so I worked through that with the buyer and began to, really get to know him and trust him, and realize that everything that had been said during the transaction, that there was no one to change the restaurant, the menu, the staff, but to continue operating, maybe innovate here and there, which they've now done, but not to impact the core operations. And that was a really good thing. In a way, it helped me transition and kind of let go of it. And since then, we've become very close friends. We're business partners. We're invested in other things together now. And I
That's
still help with little aspects of the business. I do a little bookkeeping and, some different things for him as a consultant. But outside of that, we've gotten involved in other businesses together.
That's great. It's such a good story. We don't often hear that, and to have a relationship thereafter, not only, you live in the same community and to work together. That's really special.
Yeah.
I wish all of our tech funded clients that reached out were like Dave and had, all this experience of restaurant touring and busboying and all the stuff from the bones of the restaurant up, It's great.
I will say one thing though, the buyer, he's a very successful business person, not just in the realm of restaurants, but other businesses as well. But almost daily he comes in and says, hey, there's another something for sale, another restaurant for sale in the community or this or that. Should we do it? And I'm like, I'm 62 now.
I gaslight my partner every day when we say we're going to open a new Japanese style bar that we have a concept for. I'm like, I'm okay right now. I don't need to. But that was a physical toll on me for a while, for 20 years. And now I get to see my kids and have a good job with restaurant realty.
I love the planning and concept of it, and I'd be happy to consult and help. But, I'm just done as an operator. That's what I'm saying. I'm ready to.
You've been so kind to, point out the benefits of having a niche broker that, is selling something that they understand or maybe have had experience in the past. Let's just talk to any seller, any business owner out there that's considering to sell. How would you think that an agent should prep them for a transaction like this before we actually list the business? What things might be said that would help them kind of understand what they're getting into from your perspective, the seller?
Well, I think we're sort of prepping them for the emotional roller coaster. Not all deals are going to run smoothly. Everybody thinks their asset is super valuable. It's going to sell quickly and everybody's going to want it. And that's just not the case. But helping, maybe giving them a little bit of prep and coaching and therapy in advance about what this ride through the transaction may be like, I think is a super valuable thing.
That makes sense, Patrick. So some of the key factors that I point out in our first conversation with a lead of someone who's considering selling is I still talk about the then and the now, the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic. What has that done to timeline of selling a restaurant? It's nearly doubled it in my experience. Yeah, obviously there's a ton of inventory out there. There's things that are priced more aggressively. Prices have been pushed down. For a strong, viable business like the Galley that has everything on the books and, in profits and stuff, we can still get the price for you that it warrants or what the market will bear, but it's going to take more time. What other topics currently are you kind of prepping your clients for, Patrick?
I think the major prep that I give people is the timeline, because a lot of times people come in and, even if they're not like desperate sellers, they still think that it's closer to the transaction time of a house. And they don't understand that even if I had a buyer today and we went into contract, that transaction is going to take 3+ months, 3.5 months, right? So, even with a very successful restaurant like the Galley, it's going to take 3 months to find a buyer. And then it's going to take 3 months to get through the transaction. So you're still looking at a 6-month timeline. And I think it's very important to set that expectation, up front, because a lot of times people want to be done like right now. And so, it's like, hey, where do you want to be next summer? Where do you want to be, in 6 to 8 months? That's where we're at right now. You know what I mean? And I think they need to understand that.
Yeah. And as an agent too, we want to understand what they're prioritizing. Are they wanting to get the best price for their business? Are they wanting to get out quickly? Or is it a combination of the both? I take that into consideration with what number I put in front of them in the end.
Well, it's a far more complicated transaction, too, than a real estate transaction. I think most people who have bought or sold a home know that in reality, it's a pretty straightforward process.
Yes.
I recall, the escrow process for the business was fairly complicated. Not just the valuation stuff that we talked about earlier and the allocation and getting all that right in the paperwork, but there were just a whole bunch of boxes that had to be checked off through that process that took time. In addition, in our case, we had a liquor license, which is a pretty valuable asset and impacted the valuation.
Especially in your county.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in our county. And, as a seller, that was an emotional thing too, because you basically put all of your notice that you're selling the business
before the close of escrow. And that's something for good for them to know. It's public knowledge.
You have to communicate to your staff. That was difficult because they're very concerned about how it's going to affect them, and rightly so. You can assure them all day long that the buyer doesn't intend to make any changes, but they still worry about that, right? And so you worry as an operator, am I going to lose people during this transaction because they're afraid of the unknown, so they're going to go work next door or down the street? That's one. But then you have to put that sign up on the windows that says, this license is being transferred. So everybody coming through the door for 45 days not only has questions for you, but they have questions for your staff. You need to prep the staff to answer those questions. And communicating those two things to a potential buyer is really important to start thinking about. And we went through it in the height of summer, which is our busy season. So, what's that sign on the door was a pretty common question.
I'm glad you brought that up. That is by far the most emotional milestone in our transaction, is hanging that poster, because it's public knowledge. Buyer and seller knows, staff knows, guest knows. And although at that point as an agent, I think we want to say, hey, it's pretty imminent. We're going to get to the close of escrow. Nothing is guaranteed in life, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the hard part is. No, that's great. I mean, you've been a wealth of knowledge from the buyer side, and I wish every buyer was like you, Dave. Seller side, I meant, sorry, my mistake there.
I'm done buying.
Yeah.
But if it happens, call me. I'll tell you how that went.
Yeah. I was planting a seed in your head. We have a lot of listings. Anyways, no, from the seller side, I meant, I apologize. And I wish, we could all have really level-headed, high-level experienced folks like you. We don't always, so we do have to prep them for the emotional roller coaster involved in the transaction. And hopefully we get to mitigate some of the things that, as good agents, will mitigate some of the stuff that could potentially come up, but it's always there, right, Patrick?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, you already sold your restaurant, Dave. So, what are you doing now? Because I have a little extra question for you. What are you doing now in life? I know you still consult with the restaurant some, and what else are you doing?
Yeah, so I do some consulting work for the gentleman who bought the business. He owns other businesses, not restaurant related, but I help him with some of that. And as I mentioned, we're both part of a seed venture fund in the community. So we work a lot with startup companies, entrepreneurs. They're trying to get companies off the ground in the area. Spend some time doing that. I'm a wannabe bike mechanic, so I spend a lot of time working on bikes. I'm a cyclist.
Yes. I think I know where this question is going.
Yeah, I'm going to say then maybe this is you're just segueing to your answer right there. But, if you didn't really have to work, money wasn't an object, but you still wanted to do something that made you happy, or, have some sort of hobby profession, what would it be, Dave?
Well, I'm sort of doing it in a way, being involved with, in particular, young, really smart entrepreneurial kids. And we have a lot come in particular out of Cal Poly. So being involved with the Cal Poly Entrepreneurship Program and the Small Business Development Center locally is super rewarding. But yeah, I'm a passionate cyclist. I have been for many years. The first thing I did when I, quote, retired and sold the business was I went to bike mechanic school. I'd always worked on my own bikes, but I wanted to do a deep dive. And so I went to bike mechanic training and got some professional skills. And I volunteer at a local bike kitchen a day or two a week and help people work on their bikes, train people to work on the bikes. That's sort of the free time.
I love that. That's amazing. You're going to push me to start taking my gardening classes soon then, I guess.
There you go.
Well, I really appreciate you being on and being open with us. I know it's sometimes not easy to talk about the emotional side of a transaction. So thank you for all the insights. Patrick, anything else for Dave?
I think we're good here. I really appreciate your time today, Dave.
Yeah, happy to be here. I enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you.
Right on. All right. And for our listeners, tune into us for the next couple episodes. We're going to be doing some fun stuff like top 5 lists and other things that will maybe be very fruitful for you to know as a buyer and seller. And tune in next time. Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to worry about missing an episode, you can follow the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you found today's episode interesting or useful, please share it with someone you think would benefit and consider leaving a rating and review.
Reviews help restaurant owners or buyers just like you discover this podcast and benefit from the important topics covered in the episodes. Your opinion matters to us as a listener, so feel free to leave topic suggestions and feedback for us, as we will use these to tailor the episodes to you and help you get the most out of listening.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Restaurant Deal Making Exposed. If you're considering selling your business and would like a free consultation, reach out to Patrick and Andy at therestaurantsalesbroker.com or visit www.therestaurantsalesbroker.com to learn more.